Thank you. While Senator Sanders is off to vote, I'll continue this hearing and begin with my statement. While millions of working families in California and across the nation are struggling to keep up with their bills, stay in their homes, and put food on the tables after decades of stagnant wages and the devastating impact of the current economic crisis due to the pandemic, the federal tax code clearly works well for the wealthy and for large corporations. Just looking at last couple of decades, under Republican administrations, Congress has passed tax cuts that have largely benefited top earners and business interests. The 2017 Republican tax law alone was particularly regressive, providing more than $1 trillion in tax breaks to corporations and the top 1% of earners. This law has allowed billionaires to pay effectively lower effective tax rates than many working families. It is also, and this is equally important, it has failed to deliver on the promises of a business investment boom even before the pandemic. By contrast, President Biden and congressional Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, which is delivering critical tax relief to working families by delivering direct payments, improving the earned income tax credit, and enhancing the child tax credit that will cut child poverty in half this year. As we continue our work to defeat COVID-19 and reopen our economy safely, pursuing a progressive tax agenda is critical to building a more equitable and prosperous future for all Americans. Now, I do have an area of questioning for Professor Zuckman and Ms. McGinnis relative to the IRS. Following nearly a decade of funding cuts, the Internal Revenue Service's capacity to enforce our tax laws, particularly for the wealthiest corporation and the wealthiest families who tend to have more complex filings, has been severely diminished. In the past 10 years, the agency has been forced to eliminate 22% of its staff, and funding for enforcement activities has dropped by about 30%. These cuts have primarily benefited the wealthiest households and corporations that fail to pay their taxes in full. A 2019 study found that 70% of owed but unpaid taxes, equaling $267 billion, is explained by the underpayment by the top 1%. Since 2012, the number of tax returns filed by millionaires that were audited fell by 72%. During that same period, the share of companies with more than $20 billion in assets that were audited fell 59%. Investing in the IRS would not only support fairness and the integrity of the tax code, but it would also help reduce the deficit. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that increasing IRS funding by $20 billion over the next 10 years would actually reduce the deficit by $40 billion due to the collection of additional unpaid taxes. So, Professor Zuckman and then Ms. McGinnis, can you explain how increasing funding to the IRS is critical to instituting a fairer tax system?
Absolutely, Senator. I fully agree with what you said. I think that there is an urgent need to increase audit rates and fund more thorough audits for high income and high wealth taxpayers. The data that we have today suggests that the top 1% highest earners in the US underreport about 20% of their income. So that closing tax evasion just for that group, collecting all the taxes evaded by the top 1% alone would raise more than $170 billion annually each year in extra federal income tax revenues. to me, this is the number one step to making the tax system more progressive. And let me mention that there is broad agreement among economists that better funding the IRS more than pays for itself. So this is really critically important.
Yeah, Senator, I am strongly in this camp in that I'm very concerned that overall there's sort of that you don't have to pay for anything. Ferry seems to be taking over thinking and lawmakers on the idea that tax cuts pay for themselves. No, they don't. And we're going to start hearing that about infrastructure. And as much as we need to invest in this country, it doesn't pay for itself. And we've even seen studies that if you deficit finance it, economic growth could be negative. But if there's one thing that probably does pay for itself, it's funding appropriately for the IRS to close the tax gap in things like data analysis technology. And so I do think looking at this, particularly when you compare to the other revenue options, once we acknowledge we're going to have to raise revenues, it makes really good sense to start with making sure we kind of abide by the rule of law and collect the taxes that we are owed.
Ms. McGinnis, is there as a follow-up, any specific areas of investment to the IRS to expand capacity that you would recommend or prioritize?
Absolutely. I think looking at different kinds of technology that we can figure out where the gap is likely to be, understand where we have had tax gap issues before, and enforce and audit appropriately makes a lot of sense. I also think third-party reporting will play a critical role in all of this. There's a huge gap there. I don't want us to overpromise. We're not going to be able to collect it all. People evade taxes as quickly as we can figure out how to enforce them. But there's so much better reporting now and data tracking that it will be much easier to do so.
And last follow-up question. Imagine there's a number of states that have taken this philosophy and this approach. Are there any examples, any best practices in again, investing in more thorough and equitable enforcement of tax laws and policies that have reaped good results that we should consider?
If you're asking me, I apologize. I don't know which states have the best practices. I do know we need to do a lot of updating in our states based on our unemployment issues as well. But in general, more auditors, more customer service, things that are helping taxpayers so that they don't make mistakes in the first place. All of those investments are likely to have high returns.
Professor Zuckman, is there anything you wish to add?
I think Scandinavian countries are particularly good at enforcing their tax laws, thanks to a systematic collection of third-party reported information, which allows them to send pre-populated tax returns to taxpayers. With a pre-populated tax return, you reduce evasion possibilities significantly, and so I think that's a good practice that the US should try to emulate.
White House on video.